The human brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an aggressive, predictive engine. To conserve energy, it filters raw sensory data, snapping complex environments into familiar, pre-existing categories. This biological efficiency is highly effective for navigating physical spaces, but it becomes destructive when applied to human interaction. When we process people with this same velocity, we strip away their complexity to force them into predictable mental buckets. David Brilliman defines this rapid diagnostic categorization as epistemic violence, the act of prioritizing a system's need for control over a human being's need to belong. Modern society typically views poetry as a purely aesthetic exercise or an emotional outlet. This diagram illustrates that poetry operates on a mechanical level. It is a rigorous, ancient technology, explicitly engineered to provide a systemic disruption to the brain's predictive processing algorithms. By examining the architecture of formal verse, we find a deliberate pause inserted directly into the rush of automatic thought and outrage. Brilliman takes this structural disruption off the written page and translates it into physical, interpersonal behavior. He calls this framework Protocolized Poetics. The transition from aesthetic storytelling to a testable relational protocol provides the mechanical interference necessary to override how humans automatically categorize each other. The mechanism begins with what cognitive scientists call probability design. In literature, meter and rhyme establish low-level, subconscious predictions about timing and sound in the reader's mind. The true efficacy of a poem relies on establishing that baseline rhythm and then intentionally violating it. When a sentence runs across a line break, a technique known as enjambment, it purposefully frustrates the brain's projection of how a thought should complete. In neurological terms, this structural hurdle triggers a precision-weighted prediction error. Literary theorist Victor Shklovsky codified this concept a century ago as ostranini, or defamiliarization, the practice of making the familiar strange. By artificially raising the intensity of the error signal, the text prevents the brain from cheaply predicting the ordinary away. The reader is forced to remain in a suspended state of not knowing. This forced software update slows down perception, requiring the mind to process the actual duration and intensity of the present experience. The subjective experience of wonder is the observable result of a structurally engineered failure in our brain's categorization software. This table maps how Brilliman applies this cognitive intervention to interpersonal environments, marking a transition from rational to relational epistemology. Rational epistemology dominates corporate and societal structures. It treats knowledge as a conquest, a search for certainty through bullet points, metrics, and rigid maps. Rational systems prioritize chronological data, but trauma-informed memories often exist as isolated, non-linear fragments. This structural mismatch means a metric-driven approach misses the relational insight that emerges when we witness how these fragments actually connect. Relational epistemology treats truth as dynamic and emergent. Knowledge is not a fixed asset to possess, but a rhythm co-created in the space between subjects. As seen in this sketch of a nautilus shell, the framework abandons linear progression in favor of a recursive spiral, deepening the inquiry over time. The internal critique of this framework acknowledges that merely producing philosophical ideas is insufficient. The goal is to build physical environments where the right interpersonal actions become easier to perform. Truth cannot be diagnosed or filed away. It must be navigated as a living territory through intentional relational rhythms. The direct, testable clinical application of protocolized poetics is the droplet protocol, designed for high-velocity sprints of human interaction. Step 1 is the input. The facilitator asks a small, non-diagnostic question instead of delivering a verdict. This specific framing disarms the listener, removing the immediate threat of being evaluated or sorted into a predefined category. Step 2 requires an interoceptive gap. The facilitator must hold intentional silence immediately after asking the question. This engineered gap functions exactly like poetic enjambment. It forces a structural pause, denying the brain the expected comfort of immediate completion. Step 3 governs the output. The facilitator must exercise absolute discipline and resist concluding the thought for the other person. By executing these 3 steps, the protocol successfully suspends rapid categorization. Both individuals are forced to remain in open perception. Overriding deeply ingrained human sorting habits is a structured, operational discipline. Empathy requires engineered mechanical pauses to function reliably. The framework evolves from an aesthetic theory of storytelling to a structural override, and finally into a rigorous relational protocol. Yet, as this sketch of a solitary chair illustrates, the ultimate purpose of this intense architecture is to be completely abandoned. Truly holding space for another requires physical presence. The heavy architecture of shared dogma only gets in the way. He mandates a zero-product rule. For a relational interaction to be genuine, it must produce nothing worth naming, showing, or extracting as a lesson later. This drawing of a spiral composed of wreckage represents the final measure of success. The system must entirely unpoem itself and disappear. All relational architectures are merely temporary scaffolding. When they succeed, they vanish, leaving only the profound capacity for unmediated human connection.